All right, y'all. So I know some of you guys couldn't be here tonight. I really don't want you to miss this because tonight's lesson is one of those that's going to be really hard to catch up unless you hear it live. And so I'm going to invite you to watch this along with me as we go through it. Now, I'm going to be handing out a couple charts here for you guys to have. And I'll be putting these up as we talk about it. But one of them is an atlas. So go ahead and take one, pass it around. Another sheet we're going to be passing around, and this is just the list of all the books of the Bible. It's front and back, so we have all the books of the Old Testament on there. Today we're going to be talking about Old Testament survey, which when you think about survey, you think about you survey a piece of land, you're pretty much getting an overview of how's this thing laid out, right? So that's what we're going to be looking at today, and this is going to help you when you do read the Bible just have a better understanding of how the Old Testament just makes you more familiar with it. Then the last one, and I'll show you this as we talk about it. This is the chronological order of the Old Testament. So it's going to be different from that other list of what you have in your Bible, but that's fine. But we're going to work through this, and you guys are going to learn a lot about the Old Testament today. Cool deal. And I have the notes over here. I think this all might be reversed for you, so I feel bad if this doesn't flip for you. But I'll let you know those notes when we get to them. All right, and so you can take your notes tonight on this page. It has a lot of blanks in there. This would be a good one to take notes on today. Unless you just want to keep it all in your book, that's fine. So the Old Testament, as we learned, I believe in week 1, the word testament literally just means covenant, right? And so the Old Testament could be called the Old Covenant. And so this is and just to give you an idea of the timeline, every event in the Old Testament takes place before the year 400 BC. Now, when did Jesus come to earth? 0 BC, right? So 400 years before Christ is when the Old Testament ends, approximately. So like I said, tonight we're going to be just kind of looking at the Old Testament, and so you can get a better understanding of it. The Old Testament, and you can write this on your paper, the Old Testament has 39 books. 39 books. And the purpose of the Old Testament, it's the covenant. I'm going to put this up here so you can see it. It's the covenant between God and the Israelites to bring redemption into the world. So it's going to show us how did we get here on this planet, and then it's going to introduce us to God and his promise for redemption. Now, a way to think about the Old Testament, just to kind of give you a way to kind of visualize it with something you're familiar with, is you can almost think of each book as a different state of the United States, right? Each state is different, but there's also similarities between all of them, right? And there's also different sections or regions to the country where they share more similarities than others, such as like you got the Southeast, you have the Northeast, the Northwest, the Southwest, Midwest, and you have different categories, right? We're going to be looking at that, but before we get to that, let's take a look just to give us some more perspective on the Old Testament. Go ahead and pull out your atlases. I'm going to put this here so you can see it. Every event of the Old Testament takes place in this atlas. So you can see to the far west, you have like Egypt in the southwest, and you got the Red Sea. And then at the north side, you got like the Hittites, which is where modern day Turkey would be. And then you got like the Arats, which would be, heading more towards kind of those ex-Soviet states. And of course, right in the middle, you have like Israel. A little bit further to the east, you got like Assyria, Nineveh. Then you got like Babylon going a little bit south of that. And then to like the far east, you have like Susa, which is the capital of the Persian Empire, which is at the end of the Old Testament. And you got Ur. See that city Ur? That is where Abraham came from. So think about this. In the Old Testament, the first family that it really concentrates on, or what the big family of the Old Testament is the family of Abraham. Abraham, in Genesis, you learn that Abraham travels from Ur all the way to modern-day Israel because God told him to. And we're talking about he picked up his family, his business, everything, and traveled. Now you can see in the map, there is an overlay of the state of Texas. So that shows you, gives you perspective of how far he had to go. I don't know if you've ever been to Texas, but I've heard even modern day, when you get in a car and drive, you can drive the entire day and not leave Texas. Like it's an entire day's travel to get across Texas.
My brother lives in West Texas and we've driven it.
Yeah, it's like that. Yeah, it's terrible, right? Like it's a super long drive.
The most boring ride ever.
Yeah. And to get there, you also got to notice that he probably would have had to cross a desert. So that's pretty intense, right? And so this is pretty big deal when God tells Abraham, go to the land I promised to you. When, Abraham says he has no idea, where you're taking me. He literally has no idea where you're taking me. You're going through a desert, first of all, and it's to a land that's really, really far. And you got to remember, too, back in those days, most people probably never went more than 20 or 25 miles from where they were born. So you're talking about this is like, for them, it would have felt like they're traveling across the entire world. So that just gives you an idea of where do these events take place. Now, about 90% of everything that's going to happen is going to take place in the modern day nation of Israel. 90% of it's going to take place in that area of the Old Testament. So Israel, the land of Israel, is very central to the Old Testament and New Testament. Pretty much all the New Testament, Jesus' ministry all took place in Israel. He never left Israel. Or think about it like this. 90% of the events in Israel also took place in an area from, it would be equivalent of like Ocala to Tampa. It's probably like 90 miles. Like if you were to make like a little box and like 90 miles, in length and maybe 60 miles wide, that's where 90% of the Bible is going to take place. So there's a lot of areas that, it's all pretty close. That's what I'm trying to say. Within a day or two, less than a week travels for sure for everyone. Everything takes place. And we're talking about walking on foot. All right, so I just want to give you an idea of where all this takes place. So we're talking about the Middle East. So this is a more arid type topography, very mountainous in Israel. A lot of hills, very rocky, and this is where most of the Old Testament takes place. There's one story I heard about. Maybe it was in our books that we're reading. This lady who has like a PhD was in a seminary class and rose her hand and asked the professor. When she asked, where in South America did all this take place? That was in the book, yeah. It's just like, no, it did not take place in South America. It's the Middle East.
That's when he said, learn your geography.
Learn your geography, yeah.
Makes you feel a little better? Yeah, it made me feel a lot better.
And the real cool thing is there's a lot of archaeology that they're uncovering these sites from the Bible. Because a lot of people are saying, the Bible is just a whole bunch of mythology. Well, archaeology shows, nope, these are real places. It's really fascinating.
I've seen shows on the Discovery Channel where they found like chariot wheels in the Red Sea. And they said that it was from when Moses split the Red Sea.
I've heard about that.
And they said it was from the chariots when they were going through in the sea.
Yeah, there's fascinating stuff out there. And the more archaeology stuff they find, the more it proves the Bible. And so now what I want to do is, now that we kind of get an idea of the area that all this takes place in, I don't want to take too much time because I know I'll lose you guys before, the Old Testament. We could literally spend the entire semester just looking at Old Testament survey. I mean, we could spend literally 2 years looking at Old Testament survey. There's just so much there. Some more context for, so someone hand me their Bible. So give you a little bit more context. The Old Testament makes up probably at least 75% or very close to 75% of the Bible. Like, for example, here's someone's Bible. This right here is the Old Testament. It's a thick, thick, thick part. And then you see the New Testament here, how much the New Testament is. So you can see the New Testament is very short. You can read through that in no time at all. The Old Testament, very, very thick. And because of that, it can drag on when you're trying to read the Bible in a year or something like that. The Old Testament can drag on and on. There's a lot in there. All right, so let's look at the chronological order. And so what I want to do is, we're going to talk about the different categories real quick of the Old Testament, and then we're going to go through the chronological order. And I'm just give you guys a brief sentence. But let's pull out your Old Testament survey, just like the list of the books of the Bible and how they are listed in the canon. And what I want you to do is, on the left side, so like on the left column where there's that little bit of a margin, I want you to write kind of the four main categories, or the four main parts. So next to you can draw a line to connect all the books to make sure that you categorize them together. But go ahead from Genesis to Deuteronomy. I want you to categorize those as the Torah. That's Torah. These are. Hey, you want to hand me a pen? Let's throw me a pen down here. All right. Yep. So this is the Torah. Now, and then what I want you to do is, I want you to go down and go from the book of Joshua all the way down to Esther. Now remember, this is exactly how it is in your Bible, the order that it is in your Bible. And I want you to write historical narrative. So you got the Torah, then you got historical narrative. And then you can go from Job to the Song of Solomon. And obviously, it's already kind of listed there, but that one's going to be actually, we're going to call them the wisdom / poetry. Wisdom / poetry. And then, last but not least, on the back side, this whole side is prophecy, or the prophets. Now, you can put a little line right before Hosea, and you can put minor right above that. So pretty much, so this whole part is the prophets, but after the book of Daniel, from Hosea all the way to the end of the Old Testament, these are the minor prophets. The first 5 there are what we call the major prophets. Anybody want to guess why they're called the major prophets? Well, what do you think separates major prophets and minor prophets? You think it's like baseball, like at the major leagues, and you got the minor leagues? Like some prophets are like the big dogs, and other prophets are like the little dogs. Maybe. So the only difference, you right? The minor prophets are really short. The major prophets, like for example, the book of Isaiah, I think has 60 something chapters. It's really long. Same thing with Jeremiah, really long. Ezekiel, same thing. Daniel's probably the shortest out of the major prophets. It only has 12 chapters. But the minor prophets, one of them only has 1 or 2 chapters. They're all going to be shorter. They're quicker reads. All right. So now that we see the different, the 4 main different types, you can think of these kind of like what I talked about with the United States, how you have the Southwest, Southeast, Northeast, Northwest, Midwest. Think of the same way. There's these are different. You can even look at them as different genres, right? These are different genres, and they have, and they all kind of portray different truth. So, under Torah, where you wrote Torah on the left side, this is what I want you to write down to kind of understand what each part is about. The Torah, just simply write the law. If you want to get fancy, you can write the Mosaic law, like Moses' law. The first 5 books of the Bible. And we're going to go through these books and give a quick overview so you understand what they're about. But the first 5, the Torah, is the law. Under historical narrative, well, I'm sorry, let me give you a little bit more. The Torah is the law. Under Torah, I want you to write also establishment of God's covenant with Israel. So, like I already said, the purpose of the Old Testament is pretty much the covenant between God and the Israelites to bring redemption to the world. And so what we see is that in the first 5 books out of the 39, you already have God's covenant with the Israelites. I know if you're watching this, you probably can't even read this, even if it is the right way. So, under historical narrative, what I want you to write is simply, Israel repeatedly fails to live up to God's standard, which all this is on the board. It's kind of far. Let me bring this closer. All right. Yeah. So we have our Torah filled out, and we got the historical narrative filled out. So whereas the Torah kind of introduces us to who God is and the Abrahamic family, and also to Moses, and then the covenant that God makes with Moses and the Israelites, the historical narrative takes over after the death of Moses, and pretty much gives us the history of the nation of Israel, and just pretty much shows us that the Israels don't do a very good job of keeping the covenant, their side of the covenant. Wisdom/poetry, what you can write under that is simply God's self-help books. God's self-help books. Now, something to know about the wisdom/poetry books, such as Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, is that these are not very good books to develop strong theology from. Why? It's because of the genre, right? These are not exposition, right? This is not like a sermon. These are a lot of figurative languages used in the poetry books. And another thing with the book of Proverbs that's really good to understand is that, the book of Proverbs uses a lot of stuff like, the man who pursues righteousness, all his paths will be made straight, or, he will be successful. But we all probably know people who tend to be righteous people, right? But then life just sucker punches them, and it just seems like nothing goes right for them, So the way to think about like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and, a lot of these wisdom books is that the author is not saying that 100% of the time this is what's going to happen. He's saying, though, when you look at the overall average, this is what's going to happen. There's always exceptions, to these proverbs. But the overall truths are going to lead you in the right direction. All right, and then the last genre is the prophecy. And this is simply warnings to repent and return to God. And what you'll find through the prophet books is sometimes Israelites do. More often they don't. Until there's an enemy at the walls of the city, and then they're like, all of a sudden, oh crap, we got to get it together, God, please save us. They turn their hearts back to God, when they realize, okay, the prophets, they weren't playing around when they said that we're gonna be conquered, God's hand of protection is gonna be removed from us, and that's when they're covering themselves in ash and sackcloth, was symbolic way of fasting and mourning in those days and stuff. So here we have our 4 main categories, right? And each one expresses a different truth. Each one has its own purpose and stuff like that. Any questions before we go into the books individually? And we're not going to do every single book, but the major ones we'll say something about.
Can you explain this?
Yeah, we're going to work through the books through the chronological order. Okay. All right. Any questions before we get into it? No. All right. So remember, the whole purpose of this is that you guys just need to have a kind of an overall, like a bird's eye view understanding of how the Old Testament is structured. That way, when you're studying the Bible, and that way, when you're trying to explain things to people, you have just kind of the general idea, right? You guys aren't going to leave here with PhDs or, high school diplomas in each book, but you should be able to leave here today with a better understanding of how the Old Testament is structured. So we're going to do this by going through the chronological order of the Old Testament. The reason I want to do it chronological instead of the biblical is because I don't know if you're like me, but I do a really good job when I think about something. Like I can visualize the timeline, right? You can visualize old to newer, and so I think so that's going to be the medium that we're going to use to kind of follow the Old Testament story. So what's the first book on there? Genesis. Now here's something interesting. The book of Job was probably written around the same time as Genesis. That's it. Yeah. So all the way in Genesis. So this is what I want you to write for Genesis. Just two questions. How did God's relationship with the world begin? How did God's relationship with the world begin? And then second question you ask is, where did Israel come from? How did God's relationship with the world begin, and where did Israel come from? So when you read the first 12 books of Genesis, what you see is that, we see the creation story, which we talked about, I think, in week 1. And then we learned, and then when you go past the creation story, you find out that Adam and Eve had kids, and they had kids, and you get like the flood. And then you also find out about like the after the flood, the people repopulating to build the Tower of Babylon as a way to give God the middle finger, pretty much. And then God strikes their languages and says, all right, you're going to speak different languages. You're going to categorize by the language you speak. Now go out and multiply in the world. Is that figurative or is it literal? We don't know. Old Testament, none of that stuff is before any kind of recorded history that we have. The Bible's, in other, but we don't have any writings of that period. All the writings we have would be thousands of years in the future from this. And so the last, after chapter 12 is where we get introduced to Abraham. And like we were looking at in our maps, he traveled from Ur, took his family, and traveled all the way to modern day Israel, which is about the width of Texas. And Abraham had a lot of money. He was a rich guy. He was not some poor farmer guy. He had some wealth. But he had a very unique relationship with God, and you get to get introduced to him and his wife and the promise that he made to them. And that's where the promise we get of like where God tells Abraham, like, through your seed the whole world will be blessed. And so then we're introduced to Abraham's son, and then Abraham has a son, and that son has 12 sons, which are make up the 12 tribes of Israel. But then at the end of Genesis is pretty much the end of Genesis. The book of Genesis ends with Israelites going to Egypt because of a famine in the land of Israel. So obviously, where's Exodus going to pick up? The second book of the Bible is going to pick up where the Israelites are in Egypt. And we find out that the Egyptians have enslaved the Israelites, but the Israelites, we see Exodus, you can write two things about it. You can call it the Jewish emancipation. Jewish emancipation. And then the second half is all about establishing the covenant. So we've all heard of, Moses and the Ten Commandments coming down from Mount Sinai, which Sinai, here's something interesting to think about. On your atlas, and this is still called this to this day, that is called the Sinai Peninsula, right? Kind of like just, right to, where the letter T is of Egypt, that little thing that looks like a triangle. That is, like I said, modern day That is the Sinai Peninsula. And that is where Moses, that is where God gave the law to Moses, and the nation of Israel, the newly formed nation of Israel, enters into a covenant with God. Now, Leviticus is a hard one to get through. Yes, it has a lot of weird stuff.
Words I get, and then I'm like,
Yeah. I can't get past the second half of Exodus. When God's giving Moses the commands of how to build the tabernacle, I think that's when I told you it took me a month to get through that section because I kept falling asleep. Yeah. Leviticus is, for this, simply instructions for worship. So the book of Leviticus is where you see a lot of the ceremonial sacrifices and instructions to do that. You see a lot of the laws that the Israelites are supposed to follow. Now here's something to think about. There's 12 tribes of Israel, right? The tribe of Israel that was responsible to be the priest are the Levites. Just like the jeans brand, the Levi's, right? And so think about the name of the book, Leviticus, right? Levi is the first is the first word in there. It's the what they call it, the prefix, Levi. So Numbers is simply, you can put 40 years of wandering. That's WANDERING. 40 years of wandering. And so real briefly, the Israelites enter, they get delivered from Egypt, right? The great emancipation. Then they establish the covenant with God there at Mount Sinai. And then here's something interesting. On your maps, you can see to go from Egypt to Israel is not that far. They said scholars say that it's about a 12-day march to go from Israel to Egypt. Why in the world did it take Israel 40 years to get there? The short answer is because the Israelites had a slavery mindset. And because of that, they did not trust God. And actually what God does is Moses sent 12 tribes into Canaan. The land was referred to as Canaan. And he sent 12 spies into Canaan. Out of the 12 spies, 2 of them came back and said, yes, God will deliver this land into our hands. They had the faith. The other 10 came back and they said, oh, there's giants in the land and they have militaries. If we go, we're going to be demolished. We're going to lose and it's going to be terrible. We're going to die. And so God said, all right, well, if that's the kind of faith you're going to have, you're not going into the promised land. And so he said that no one who left the land of Egypt as an adult is going to enter the promised land, except for the 2 spies, Joshua and Canaan. Even Moses was not allowed to enter the promised land because he disobeyed God. God told him to speak to this rock because they were in a desert area, right? Very arid. And there was this rock and the Israelites needed water. And so God told Moses, go and speak to this rock and water will come forth. But Moses, I don't know if he wanted to show off or what, but he took his rod and he struck it instead of speaking to the rock. And when he struck the rock, a river came forth. But God told him, said, listen, I told you what to do and you disobeyed me. You're not allowed to enter the promised land either. So you can imagine Moses was probably heartbroken on this. But for 40 years, it wasn't like they were literally just wandering around, like walking every day. What they would do is they would kind of like move, they'd live in an area maybe for a couple years, move to another area for a couple years. And actually towards the end of the 40 years, they actually took some land on the east side of the Jordan River. So you can see there on the map, you see like where Jerusalem is, that dot, and there's like a little river to the right of it. That's the Jordan River. And it kind of separated West Israel from East Israel. And on the eastern side, the Israelites had actually conquered some of that land under the command of Moses. And actually 2 of the 12 tribes, they kind of set up cities in that area. And so when the Israelites do move into the promised land in the book of Joshua, 2 of the tribes, they said, can we just keep our families over here on the east side of the Jordan where we've kind of established our cities? And Joshua said, yeah, that's fine, but you still have to send your men to fight with us. we're all one team. And so, but anyways, so just want to show you that for the book of Numbers, it talks about, just kind of their disobedience and lack of faith and stuff. Deuteronomy, just simply put recap. So recap of the law. You can almost say it's Moses' last speech, pretty much. Moses gives this lengthy speech to the Israelites, and he's telling them, he reiterates, he rereads the law to them and invites the Israelites to, once again in their hearts to adopt this covenant. And so you're talking about, this is a 40-year gap now. So they're talking about to a whole new generation. Like, will you enter to this covenant with God? And the Israelites, of course, say yes. And Moses says, hey, listen, you guys are going to be going into the land. I'm not going with you. But Joshua is going to lead you guys into the land. So it's kind of the transition now. We're no longer just going to be these wandering sojourners, I guess. We're going to be going and taking the promised land. So that takes us out of the book of the Torah, or the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, the traditional author of these books is Moses. Did he write all of it? No. Did he write most of it? Probably. So, any questions on the Torah? Any thoughts? No. All right. Now, a lot of the Torah is written in the narrative form, so a lot of it is stories. There is some other part like Leviticus, which is a lot of like laws and stuff like that, and Numbers has like literally where they take a census of all the people. But overall, most of it is narrative, and most of it is historical. But it's special because it is the kind of like this is right here is the Jewish Bible. So the Jews, they have their own Bible, right? This is the Jewish Bible. It's called the Torah. It's the first 5 books of the Bible.
Is that all they have? It's just that?
So that's their central Bible. And then these other writings, like the prophets and the wisdom books, these are kind of like separate Bibles. These are like additional writings. All right, let's move down to the historical narrative, which personally I enjoy. This is some of the best reading inside of the Old Testament. And honestly, most of the sermons that you hear when people preach it, a lot of it comes from this section. Outside maybe like Proverbs and Psalms. But these are full of stories. Like, for example, Deuteronomy, Moses dies. Who takes his place? Joshua, which is the next book there. For Joshua, simply write conquer. They're conquering the land of Israel, right? Conquering the land. You just write conquer, though. It's a conquest. And we see God's faithfulness. And here we are. We have a whole bunch of people who, maybe the people who conquered the land weren't slaves as kids, but they came from pretty much a family of slaves. So we're talking about people who did not have military backgrounds, did not have weapons. This is a very poorly trained and equipped army, but yet God uses them to conquer a much more powerful enemy. Judges. At the end of Joshua, the second half is pretty much they're divvying up the land between the 12 tribes. It's super boring. It really is. Remember, all the Bible is equally inspired, but not equally valuable to our daily lives. Judges, just write crazy cycle. Samson, yes, Samson is one of the judges. Yep.
You said crazy what?
Crazy cycle. So this is the time when the land of Canaan, the Israelites have established themselves inside the kingdom, inside Canaan, but they did not eliminate all their enemies. God told them to wipe out everyone, which some people would say, well, that's cruel of God that God would tell the Israelites to wipe out everyone. But when you look at it in context of what the Israelites had to go through for the next hundreds of years, you understand why God maybe said, conquer everyone. Why? Because the people that remained in the land, not only did they pass on their pagan culture, but they also during times would enslave certain villages. They would send these raiding parties out, take the women, take the children, take the food, take the wealth, take their animals. So these people were constantly a thorn in the Israelite side because they did not follow God's command to totally conquer these nations and subdue them. They allowed for certain pockets to remain, and those pockets would grow over time and cause the Israelites a lot of harm. And you see that in Judges. So what typically would happen, the reason I call it a crazy cycle is because this was the period, I believe it was a few hundred years even, when the Israelites did not have a formal government. And so each tribe kind of governed themselves. But what would happen is, like I said, like the Philistines would rise up. They would go conquer a village, take away the women, and it'd be horrific stuff. And what the Israelites would cry out to God and say, God, where are you? We need your help. Now, the reason I call it a crazy cycle is because usually the Israelites were turning their back on God, right? They were worshiping the God of their neighbors and stuff like that. And they turned their back on God. But then, there'd be heartaches that would come because of that. And the Israelites would cry out, God, we need your help. And then God would raise up a judge. It was a temporary ruler that would pretty much raise an army and go and bring justice and conquer their enemies for them. But I call it crazy cycles. This had to happen over and over. But we get some really, really interesting stories from the book of Judges, like Samson. Samson is in the book of pretty much a womanizer.
I'm gonna have to reread that story again. 'Cause I was so mad at Samson when I read it.
Oh, Samson's, he's a good guy, but he's a bad guy.
Yeah, but I was so mad. I was angry at him. I know
Yeah.
that sounds funny, but I was really mad.
Yeah, don't name your kid Samson.
No.
And don't name your kid Jonah either. They were called by God, but they're not great examples. Come on, literally. Samson pretty much turned his back on God because he wanted to get with this really pretty girl.
Yes, he finally
Yeah.
gave in.
He gave
to
in.
Chick, and
Yep.
That's why I was mad.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh my
It's a
God.
crazy cycle.
I called Dustin up and I was yelling at him like, can you believe this dude? I'm not kidding, I was mad.
There's one judge. It's really interesting. I forget his name, but there was this king that had conquered this area of this one tribe of Israel, enslaved the people, and so the people cried out, and God raised up a judge, and the Bible says he was left-handed. Now this is very important because in those days, and it's still like this in a lot of places in the Middle East, where the left hand is used for wiping your rear, right hand is what you use for fighting. And when you go into the king's court, they would check you for weapons. But since everyone was left-handed, your sword would be on your left thigh. So you reach across your body to grab your sword. And so when he came in, they checked for weapons, and he didn't have any on his right side he didn't have any on his left side because he was left-handed. And so, but he told the king, he said, listen, king, I have a very special message from God that's just for you. And he's like, well, deliver it right here. He's like, no, I can't do it here. This is just for you. And he kind of led him on, like enticed him. And so the king's like, okay, well, come over here. So he pretty much took him to what law scholars say was probably a bathroom. But the scripture says that the king was huge, so much fat. And so it says that when he was alone, he locked the door, and the judge, he pulled out his sword and thrust it into the king's belly. And it says that it was the king was so fat that the sword got sucked in. They couldn't even pull it out. And so he snuck out the window or something like that, or he left. And they were knocking on the door like, King, are you okay? Are you doing anything? But they didn't answer. Then finally, after a couple hours, they're like, okay, we got to no longer, we don't want to, okay, this is weird. So they opened up the door and he was dead, but that was a judge. That's in the book of Judges. Judges is a fun book. A lot of horrific stories. There's some rated R stuff in there. It's terrible. But it's also really, it's the narratives are very entertaining. All right, so now, I'm sorry, we didn't follow the chronological order. I'm so sorry. I was meant to go through this in chronological order. Where are we at? Judges? Okay. So the only one I skipped over is Job. We'll come back to that when we get to the wisdom books. That's fine. Ruth is the next one in the chronological order. Ruth takes place during the same time as the book of Judges. So this is in the period before the kings. And so for Ruth, you could just write love story.
I like this book too.
Love story, and then put in parentheses, King David's grandma. It's either grandma or great grandma, but anyways, but it's a really neat story.
The movie, I think, is on Netflix or Amazon Prime. It's one of the.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Boaz. It has a fun name in there too. Boaz. She marries. They have like a joke about that. Like you can look it up. Boaz joke.
That's pretty good.
So, but continuing in the on the chronological, you come to 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. These 1 Samuel, just write first king. So the Israelites get the first king, King Saul. King Saul, good guy at the beginning, bad guy at the end. But Samuel, the name Samuel is actually a prophet, or excuse me, a priest. Samuel was, so First Samuel starts off talking about Samuel and his birth and stuff like that, and how Samuel gets raised inside the temple pretty much by the priests. But it ends talking about King Saul. And then it introduces us to David. 2 Samuel is pretty much King David. King David's, we'll call it King David's kingship. Or reign, something like that.
Didn't Saul have another name too? Or is that somebody else I'm thinking of?
It's probably in the New Testament, Paul's original name was Saul.
Okay.
And then he changed his name to Paul.
Okay.
Which I think makes sense because especially when he was Saul, he was going around killing Christians, But during the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel is when you get Amos and Hosea, the prophets, which nothing significant to mention there. You'll notice on the chronological order that you see 1st and 2nd Chronicles. You'll see 1st and 2nd Chronicles. See right there underneath for 2nd Samuel. 1st and 2nd Chronicles is pretty much a recap of the entire history of the nation of Israel. So when you, yeah. And a lot of the stories are told from a different perspective. Some of them, sound the same and are very similar. Some of them are different, but it's pretty much, it chronicles the stories of the kings of Israel.
So it's not going back as far as Moses?
The First Chronicles starts up, I think, around King Saul.
You gotta explain these purple boxes.
So, at the end of 2 Samuel, you have the death of King David. And the beginning of, and this is where you get the purple boxes. In 1 Kings, you're introduced to, you can just call it more kings. And so 1 Kings starts with King Solomon. King Solomon took what David started and took it to the next level. But King Solomon, what you'll find out, he's the one that wrote the wisdom books of A Song of Solomon, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. King Solomon, he's considered the wisest person. He's called the king of wisdom, you could say, because he asked God for wisdom and God gave it to him. And so he was world renowned for his wisdom that God gave him. But he also had a weak will. So he had hundreds of concubines and wives, and a lot of them were probably political, but still, he was not a good moral figure of Israel for the Israelites to follow. But at the death of King Solomon, this is the important part, the kingdom splits. Israel was one united kingdom from the time of Saul and King David and King Solomon. But after King Solomon's death, the kingdom splits, which God actually prophesied to David when he was a king. He said that pretty much after your son's reign's over, your kingdom's going to split.
That was in 1 Kings?
What's that?
1 King or 2nd King?
1 Kings is I believe maybe Solomon's reign lasts through 1 Kings. I don't remember. But yeah, the kingdom splits. So you see where in the purple boxes it says like south and north. That just refers to like the northern kingdom. So the northern kingdom is called Israel. The southern kingdom is called Judah. The southern kingdom is where Jerusalem was. The northern kingdom, the capital, you ready for it? You're going to like this because of your devotions. The capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, Samaria. So you got the Samaritans. So the Samaritans were descendants from the northern tribes. So King David came from the tribe of Judah, so they kept Jerusalem and the southern part. So the only thing I don't understand is why it says like Amos and Hosea, why it says north on there. Doesn't make sense to me because the kingdom doesn't split until First Kings on the chronological side of things. Second Kings, just right again, more Kings part 2. So when you read it, it's kind of interesting because they'll say like so-and-so was the king of the southern kingdom, so-and-so was the king of the northern kingdom, and their reigns kind of overlap, and it just follows some of the stuff. First and Second Kings, like I said, just you see the failures of the kings. Pretty much the northern kingdom of Israel did not have one king who stayed true to God. Not one righteous king. The southern kingdom had a few. They had a few kings that were good. Most of them were bad. At the end of Second Kings and Second Chronicles, since they kind of overlap, is where they are conquered by the Babylonians. So First and Second Chronicles, you just say recapped. Now, before we get to Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, let's jump down to the poetry books real quick. Let's jump down to Job. Job is some people say it's older than Genesis. Some people say that's the first book of the Bible that was written. Job, all you can write is I'm trying to think of something silly.
Are you talking about like the completion of Genesis? Because obviously you need
Yeah,
creation.
yeah, the writing of Genesis.
Okay.
Yeah.
Story of misery.
In misery.
Job's my friend.
First.
Job is my friend. He's a motivator.
Good, bad, better. That's Job. He has it's a poetry book. He could be literal, probably figurative, like we've already talked about. But pretty much the truth. There's one truth at the end of Job that really kind of brings it all together, and that is simply that the universe is like God literally tells Job, "Do you want to try to run the universe for a day?" He's like, "Do you want to try to run it?" And Job's like, and God's pretty much like, "No, there's no way you can do it because there's so many intricate parts. Like, how do you choose to do to this person, but that's going to affect this person?" He said, "There's so many things interwoven in the universe that no man can even start to even grasp how to run the universe for the day. So don't worry about it." Psalms, just literally write songs. Most of them were written by King David, but not all of them. Some of the Psalms are actually written all the way up into maybe just like 100 or 200 years before the events of the New Testament, actually. So it's kind of interesting. It takes place over a very wide period of time. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, we already talked about it, but all King Solomon. King Solomon wrote them all. Song of Solomon was when he's young. It's pretty much a love erotics. That's the erotic novel of the scripture. They use a very figurative language about the love of a man and his wife. Young love, passion. That's what it is. The passion book.
There's I'm gonna have to look it up.
Yeah. But
It's hilarious.
yeah, I gotta try to get through this. My battery's about to die on my phone. Ecclesiastes is when King Solomon is old. He's very critical, and but it also brings a lot of perspective. One of my favorite books to read. It'll make you feel kind of depressed while you're reading it, but when you get to the last chapter, it makes you feel good. Pretty much says life is meaningless, all this stuff is meaningless, but then at the end, he's pretty much like, but you know what? If you work hard and you're content with what you have, life is actually pretty good if you pursue wisdom, So it's
Let's back up.
you got to read it all as one. Prophecy. So let me look at the timeline real quick. So you have Lamentations, which is one of the major prophets. If you look on the chronological one, Lamentations literally means sad. Like he's sorrowful. Why? Because he's seeing the destruction that's about to take place inside Jerusalem. And then Ezekiel and Daniel take place during the 70 years of exile. So so the northern kingdom is actually conquered like 100 years or something like this before Judah is conquered and Jerusalem's conquered. So the northern kingdom goes away first, and then the southern kingdom gets conquered. Like I said, quite a bit later. But Ezekiel and Daniel are written while the Israelites are in captivity in Babylon. So their prophets, really interesting stuff. We just went through Daniel as a church. Then you get, after the 70 years of exile, though, you see Ezra and Nehemiah. You can put those two together. That's back in the narrative side. Ezra and Nehemiah is all about rebuilding. So this is the Israelites' return to Jerusalem. Ezra rebuilds the temple. Nehemiah rebuilds the wall. Nehemiah is a great book on leadership. Great book on leadership. And Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, those are just prophets that prophesied during the time of the return. The book of Esther, I believe, that takes place when you look at your map all the way on the far east side in Susa, which is the capital of the Persian Empire. Fascinating story about using your position to help, God's people out. All right, but that's it that I want to mention through the books, and we'll go ahead and turn this off before my battery dies.